Kiribati is a nation of low-lying coral atolls scattered across the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. For thousands of years, the people of Kiribati have learned to live in harmony with their isolated and fragile islands. But in recent times, rapid modernization and a growing population has also increased the demand for more permanent housing and infrastructure. There is no question that crowded low-lying atolls like South Tarawa will be amongst the first places on Earth to feel the real impacts of climate change and rising sea levels. That is why the government of Kiribati is becoming increasingly concerned about a growing practice that is literally undermining their last defense against the Pacific Ocean.
We're facing some huge pressures here in the South Tarawa environment. We've got some 40,000 people on about 10 square miles of land. So these are extremely high density population. We're running out of room for houses in South Tarawa. It's a very simple premise. If you have built on a very soft sandy shoreline that is dynamic and likely to move depending on weather cycles, storm cycles, etc. and season, then if it's a small local house that can be picked up and moved, there's not too much bother if we suddenly get erosion. However, if you've just invested $20,000–$30,000 in building your family block home out of cement, there's no way you can move that structure, and indeed there's no way you can probably afford to move it in the context of the local environment here.
According to SOPAC, the Pacific Islands Applied Geoscience Commission, local beach miners are now removing more than 70,000 cubic meters of sand and gravel from South Tarawa's beaches every year. This is enough material to fill 30 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
I think we were all quite seriously surprised by the volume of extraction. It's quite clear driving around South Tarawa that beach mining activity is commonplace, and in fact there's hardly an area in South Tarawa where it isn't actually occurring. But on any given day, I guess you're just seeing small rice bags of aggregate stacked up by the road. But once we actually looked at the figures, we estimate something in the region of 70,000 cubic meters a year is being removed just from the beaches alone, and this is just by household, small-scale activity.
Once this vital protective material is removed, it cannot be replaced by natural replenishment, leading to even greater erosion and increasing vulnerability to the impacts of storms and changing weather patterns.
We already see erosion all up and down South Tarawa because of beach mining. Erosion isn't just about the loss of land, it's about the loss of your protective system that's going to protect you from storm waves, etc. That's bad enough, but in the context of climate change, where weather patterns can change, we might be having more storms, we might be having higher water, this is a disaster, okay? And we really have to address it now.
If you continue to mine your beaches, eventually you have no beaches left, and you have nowhere to situate your house, and you have nowhere for your children and your grandchildren to situate their houses. So that's an economic imperative, particularly if you have lots of flooding going on, as there is at the moment, of the local hospital and the maternity ward. So every time there's really major tides, the maternity ward gets flooded. And part of the reason for that is because there is too much mining going on.
You can tear down mountains in most countries because they do have mountains. You can quarry the mountains. But here you're quarrying the very land on which you are standing. And so it is fragile. It's a very serious problem because in most countries they do have mountains. We don't. We're living in a country which is barely 2 meters above sea level on average. And so it is a serious issue. And so any substantial mining or even minimal mining is going to affect the shoreline. And so it is a serious problem even before the problem of sea level rise. And so that in fact compounds the problem that we already have been facing.
Beach mining is an important source of income for many families in South Tarawa. Tebikis Tabu and her husband Tabu Tavita say they are almost totally reliant on the sale of aggregates to support their family.
Narangairas konan korosibu tas konan koroi tayan pain kiri pesa kapua ke ibun ngono na bende kan interakan me ani pun nasuna roi ari yaki pakapa katwa tepung mete wiki mete na makaina ke tiri kita wan mete tiri kita wan awe karawan magure kai takin narun kang hai tiran kari ke mane ka wari kai kai kang sakti ben nangin parin tebtai ko pun mga nangin kain na no kya paina o paina na ben tebtai ako nande ke mente itirare ke are ko ota ke toy na ko nang kanay ama ko ri honet aki ana ko nananay pare kana tawa kari ke yamma ko rin tataw tek katoy ako nanto kin kanyari pare ke yaman may ibukin tangiran sensiro ya ya kunanto parian na po kungen kusian day ni ani ana pun na konat ya kunanto si kana yare kay maguri yare na kay yaman na yai tay nga bandangina pariang inin kaya na kan tatapayo akin maguri kang step men na ka maguri o bandangin te sa na ka pun kay ni roy pundik maguri ang kanya ni roy kang angin tetay ya on magin na pakari kaya kari kaman ke
ya kami singaya kaya atan na kamuri
ikaw nga karawa. Kanga koroi mit takakaroke pare rawa taram bayay kain dari kim ni kangan. Yanangin ikaw nga ikaw pure. Kanga yagi kakwa. Yagi kakwa.
Karen benar ko buni yare yang bukit agar apa ya kan. Ay yang tak tadi ngar ko nga yare kena pagi. Ana sekarang duta na napakaran ito ay buta kiro wana kine. Kiri bun to wara ra so kame. Kana ya dai tire kan naro lagi. Makanya harus lebih aku kata orang pun tengah perjalanan dan kita. Okay, tengah aku ya. Ada kan siang. Ada tempat yang ada aku di mana dah. Kalau aku dia nak usin kamu semua ini, angka ya apa ini lagi? Kalau sini kita ya mana cara? Ya kita mau cara terkait. Kalau aku pun naruh kosi mana, kalau aku naruh, kalau aku naruh lagi lah. Tahu kita anak buah kayak bos sungai kalau aku. Kalau cuma orang makai lagi ya uas baru orang.
In an effort to control beach mining, the government of Kiribati established a permittance system to try and restrict people to mine in designated areas.
We don't have enough staff at the moment to do the enforcement. We also have we experience that the miners not only carry out the activity during the working hours where the staff are available in the office, but they can do the mining during the nights and during the weekends, and so that's also another problem. The problem is maybe the lack of awareness by people.
The government of Kiribati realizes that finding a sustainable source of building aggregate is a priority for the country.
I think it's become more critical, especially if not only for South Tarawa because of the population flow. South Tarawa at present hosts about just a little under half the population. And so for South Tarawa, the problem is critical. Much of the government infrastructure is actually built on South Tarawa because it is the center of development. It is where the population is. So that brings a lot of pressure and need for aggregate for the building of infrastructure.
What we're doing in relation to the ECS is we're doing a final review of available data.
Faced with growing demand for building aggregates, the government approached SOPAC for advice on sourcing more sustainable supplies of sand and gravel. As part of an EU-funded project to reduce vulnerability in Pacific states, SOPAC used a mixture of scientific, economic and social assessments to determine the viability of dredging aggregates from the lagoon bed. Computer models were used to help determine if aggregates could be dredged from the lagoon in an environmentally and economically sustainable way.
In terms of cost, the lagoon bed resource makes the most sense. And that's because we can land it on shore at a price that would be likely to be affordable by your average family in South Tarawa. Whereas if we import aggregates from a larger high island, they're going to be landed at a cost that's probably going to be prohibitive to the average family, and so it won't replace beach mining. We know in one resource area we have a 50-year supply, and SOPAC's been involved in surveying a second resource area that could be another 50 years at least. So I think as long as there's continual work to survey, to monitor the environment as the dredging occurs, then yes, it is the best option, and it can be a sustainable option for the island.
Armed with this information, the Kiribati government has developed a funding proposal to establish a government-owned company to dredge aggregate material from the lagoon. SOPAC believes the proposal is economically viable, but any plans to dredge the lagoon will also need to address the ongoing issue of beach mining.
From my point of view, in order to have it successful, we need to ensure that the company can provide, can meet the demand to the users, and also to ensure that the effective enforcement of the mining on the island is up to speed. Because my feeling is that if the company is go ahead and starts, and people still, I mean the locals still do the mining, then what I feel is that they can offer cheap prices of the aggregates, and people, the users, will turn to the locals rather than to the company, and that might make pose some problems to the company, I think.
We're fairly confident that, from a technical and environmental perspective, that an alternative of taking aggregates from the lagoon is quite a viable prospect, but obviously the social and economic perspective still needs some further consideration.
The more thorny issues that need to be contemplated are the social impacts of trying to relocate dredge offshore, because with the local community being so heavily involved in actually hand mining, these people are going to be in competition to sell their sand and their gravel with the company, and if they're able to undercut that, will really affect the profitability and the sustainability of the company, which means, of course, that you're not actually preventing sand mining or beach mining at all.
As I said, most people would much prefer to take the sand off the beach, regardless of the consequences, which may not be directly affecting them now, but it may affect their neighbors, or it may affect the future generation. And so in that respect, legislation may be necessary. At the same time, I think we have to be mindful that there will be a sector of the community which will lose out as a result. So for us, we have to balance all of these considerations.
I think a very important issue here is to make sure that everybody understands what the consequences are of beach mining. Okay? And when the survey of households was done to find out how much beach mining was going on by families, it was clear that not everybody understood what the consequences were of taking sand and gravel from the beaches, and the fact that this actually led, in some cases, to erosion.
The government plans to support the dredging proposal with an increased investment in regulation and programs to educate the public on the continued risks of mining Tarawa's fragile beaches. SOPAC's Dr. Webb believes it is vital for Kiribati to focus on practical solutions that can help to reduce their vulnerability to the impacts of climate change.
We are looking at a fairly sobering outlook in the long term for very low-lying atolls in terms of climate change predictions. However, I think we need to be mindful that people here are living in their traditional homes, in their traditional ways, on their island that they've inhabited for thousands of years. And we can't just pull away and say, well, there's no point in managing the environment, it's all over anyway. We still need to try as hard as we can to keep the island as resilient and healthy as we can.
SOPAC believes the government of Kiribati may also be providing an invaluable model for other small islands that are also facing difficult choices in an uncertain future.
I think that this is an ideal example of science and policy fusing together to be able to make people better informed, because it gives them a chance to see the pros and cons of a situation from all sides. They've got a fantastic wealth of information to allow them to produce a very robust, well-considered and well-rounded policy.
Problems such as global warming and sea level rise may be far beyond the influence of tiny countries such as Kiribati. But its leaders realize they must now do everything within their power to protect their land, their people, and their future.
I think this is the biggest challenge for mankind, I think, in this millennium. And I hope that we take this seriously. For countries like Kiribati, it is a matter of survival. Quite often there is a question as what the economic cost would be. We're not talking about economic costs. We're talking about survival as a nation.
With the help of international partners such as SOPAC and the European Union, the government of Kiribati is determined that the fight to protect its fragile coastland will not slip through its fingers.